This is lecture 8 in the Western peace traditions, and I'm going to call it Islam, the Constantinian Fall Thesis. Touch briefly on the tensions between just war and the Beatitudes, and then end with the Point Grey rock story from Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver. So Islam, you may wonder what Islam has to do at this stage of the journey of Western peace traditions. I might add, before I move on, as we're approaching this particular course, the first two-thirds of it, because it's called the Western peace traditions, is about a historic approach in understanding, in terms of thinking through what peace is, both in thought, word, and deed. The latter third of the course will be looking at some of the major themes of the causes of war: positive peace, negative peace, terrorism, peace groups. The last chapter in Approaches to Peace, the book we'll be using for the last third of the course, is on peace groups, non-government groups, the role of the United Nations, the role of the state, advocacy groups, the many of these different organizations that try to embody in their own imperfect way a concern for peace. The other important thing to note when we're dealing with Western peace traditions, and I'll repeat this again and again, it goes back to obviously the old Greek notion of the agon, the agonistes, the agony, the struggle. In great literature you get protagonists, the one who is struggling for the good, the just, the peaceful, and those who oppose them, the antagonists. So again, you have the language of agon, and underneath the language of agon is the recognition that life is thick with conflict, clashes, different interpretations. Worst case scenario, people turn bitter, they retreat from one another, they refuse to work towards reconciliation. Terrible things can be said to one another in the process. The extreme end of that is, of course, people turn violent and wars occur. Violence in the streets, or violence between nation states, or violence between ethnic groups. But conflict is built into the very structure of almost the human journey, and this is where the issue of peace comes in, is how does reconciliation take place. And often for many people, when conflict emerges, there's two reactions, equally unhelpful and yet often habitual in the way these things are handled. The one is the fight model. If someone feels threatened, like an animal, they fight back, and so the gloves come out, and conflict, people turn on one another, and so war is a way of dealing with conflict that ends in peace, but it's usually the peace for the strongest person. And that's one way of making sense of peace, is peace through strength. The other, for people who are not inclined towards fight, is the flight mentality. People run from the fray because conflict is too difficult to deal with. They don't know how to resolve the conflict, the tension between friends, within family, between communities, between nation states. And so they flight, they retreat. And of course that doesn't lead to reconciliation or meaningful peace, either the fight or the flight model. But given the fact that conflict is at the heart of much of the human journey, very important to understand the means. Usually the third way is dialogue. But what happens when the other does not want to interact, does not want to hear, does not want to engage, is not interested in reconciliation? So dialogue is contingent on two groups, whether at a personal or an interpersonal level, agreeing they want to reconcile. But if one doesn't, where do you go from there, and where does mediating parties come in? But that also hinges on a willingness at an interpersonal, and of course at a larger political level, of two parties willing to come together to work through conflict. And so peace is obviously one of those key elements of the human journey, as is war, and built into both of those is the issue of conflict, and then the Greek notion of agon, or the agony involved in both the protagonists and the antagonists, or two protagonists or two antagonists, trying to solve difficult issues beyond fight or flight. And so this is important. But that was a little bit of a detour. I want to move along quickly here, looking, as I mentioned, Islam, and you might wonder, where does Islam fit into this? The Constantinian fall thesis, and then move into the just war, Beatitudes, and finish with the Point Grey rock situation. Now, Islam itself emerges in the 7th century, so I am fast-forwarding this a little bit, but it fits into what I'm going to say in terms of the Constantinian fall thesis. The Muslim tradition emerges from a heritage in which they argue within the Jewish tradition there was a revelatory tradition through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the Jews themselves forfeited through their own lack of integrity, their own lack of authenticity, what it meant to be true to the God they say was back of the founding of the Jewish heritage. Next then came along the Christian tradition, and Jesus himself was a reformer, so Muhammad would argue, of the Jewish tradition, and just as the prophets in the Jewish traditions constantly tried to reform Judaism, and eventually that failed again and again. Jesus was the next step in this process in which conflict was at the center of it. Reformers come along, prophets come along, and then Jesus was the next step. But Christianity, post-Jesus and into the 2nd, 3rd centuries, it itself became deformed. It itself violated its high principles. It itself lost the fire of authentic prophetic tradition, and Christianity through the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries deteriorated, it thinned out, it betrayed Judas-like its own high calling and heritage. And within the Muslim tradition, the argument that with Muhammad then came along and continued the revelatory story that began with Judaism, the next step was Christianity. But just as both traditions betrayed their heritage through not living up to the highest ideal, so Muhammad came along, the revelation from Allah, Mary Gabriel, to renew the tradition. So this is a read of history which is very important, that feeds into hence the legitimate founding of Islam as almost a dialectic in terms of Allah revealing himself through two earlier traditions, and then how each of those betrayed what Allah meant their traditions to be, and Muhammad was the great purifier of true religion. Interestingly enough, the Constantinian fall thesis, which is they're buying into, is that as Christianity grew and became the dominant religion within the faltering Roman Empire, and Constantine in the 4th century and Theodosius later, both drew in Christianity to be the official religion of the waning Roman Empire. Now, the Muslim argument to this is that Christianity is waning by the 4th or 5th century as it assimilated to power, but in fact the great Christian political activists of the 4th and 5th centuries were very concerned with war and peace issues, whether it's Augustine or Ambrose, that are quite willing again and again to challenge the emperors of the West in terms of turning on city-states and other places who they feel challenged imperial interests. The great Christian theologians like an Ambrose or an Augustine in the West were very critical of warlike tendencies, even from Christian emperors of the time, like I mentioned, a Constantine later in the 4th century, Theodosius, and Ambrose, for example, Bishop of Milan, refused to even allow the emperor into the cathedral in Milan because of the slaughter he was engaged in Thessalonica, because of the Thessalonians dared to challenge Theodosius as an emperor. And so the same within the East, the great women and men of the East, Basil, Macrina, Chrysostom. These people were equally critical of the synthesis of church and empire, in which you had aggressive emperors who were engaged in war or creating injustice or living a very indulgent lifestyle where there was poverty on the streets. It was the Christians, theologians and bishops and archbishops who were at the forefront of challenging unjust peace. So the emperors often want order or peace, but often it's unjust. As we looked at the Beatitudes last week, the many bishops and archbishops and priests, deacons and laity were engaged in calling for a just peace. And so this is what's called the Constantinian fall, the fall of the church. In fact, that's just not true historically. So the Muslim read of the historic development of Christianity into the patristic area of the 2nd to the 7th centuries very much distorts Christian history. In fact, many of the Orthodox traditions see this period as a golden age, not a decline of Christianity, but the great maturation, the golden age of Christianity. And so the Constantinian fall thesis, which certain Protestants will pick up on, and certainly the Muslim tradition draws from, it very much distorts the Christian thinking of war and peace, just peace, and the critique of emperors and military that was engaged in war and undermining just peace, but quite willing to be unjust and have peace. Now, if we move this forward a little bit to Augustine, who's 5th century, stands on the shoulders of some of these thinkers I've mentioned earlier of the West and the East. This is a period of time when the Roman Empire is increasingly so. Its imperial overstretch and its colonizing of other people. Increasingly what happens when any empire does that, there's going to be freedom groups. They're called terrorist groups because they threaten the dominant power, the empire. Increasingly now as Rome weakens, they're beginning to come south into Rome. The Goths, the Visigoths, and Rome lacks the resources to battle back anymore. So again, you have this war. So how then, when foreign freedom fighters, called by terrorists, obviously Rome calls them terrorists, they're threatening the empire, it's coming apart, it's unraveling in many ways, but they're quite willing to use violence, just as violence was used on them to colonize them, tribal peoples. Now they're using violence on those who had violated them as a people. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, responsible for a large area diocese, his question was, so you've got the Beatitudes on one hand. The Beatitudes, as much as possible, are about just peacemaking. If you move further throughout the Beatitudes into the Sermon on the Mount, it's about loving and caring for your enemy. It can be interpreted, the Sermon on the Mount, which I didn't touch on the full Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 5 to 7. I mostly lingered with the Beatitudes. But the larger, fuller Sermon on the Mount leans and can be interpreted as a direction, in a dovish direction towards pacifism, variations of simple pacifism or sophisticated pacifism. And of course, the founder of Christianity, unlike the founder of Islam, died on a cross rather than using violence. He would rather be victimized by those who would use violence rather than use violence. And you have obviously texts in the Christian tradition where he could have used violence, and Peter cuts off someone's ear, he puts it back on. He could call angels to protect, he doesn't. So you get the very foundation of Christianity is at one level, it seems to be a non-violent pacifist tradition, rather than using violence. If you have, and you get this as well in certain Plato's thinking as well, rather than being an agent of violence, better to non-violently engage that. So Augustine is grappling with, on the one hand, this Sermon on the Mount, the founder of Christianity, Jesus. Many of the early Christians were martyrs rather than using violence. Many of the early Christians, in fact, who before they had come to Christianity were in the Roman military. They leave the Roman military because the violence and the imperial nature of the Roman military and how they're treating others. So Christianity has, up through the first few centuries, a certain suspicion of empires, imperial overstretch, war as an extension of empire, and they lean, given their founder, Jesus, who dies on the cross, and the martyrs that come after that, a pacifist position. But with the Goths and the Visigoths coming into Rome, Augustine was in a position, well, he's watching, or potentially watching, hundreds and thousands of people within his diocese, within the area, being killed, being raped, being slaughtered. So is there a place for just war? And as I've looked at in an earlier lecture, what are the conditions for just war? And where is pacifism as an absolute inadequate in dealing with resisting a violence which is taking place against evil? So when Augustine's grappling was, how did you live in the tension between ideally pacifism in a sophisticated way, drawing from the Sermon on the Mount and Beatitudes, is the best way to go. But at what point does that perpetuate greater injustices and allow the powerful, the military, who are, in this case, the Goths and the Visigoths and others, to use their power, their force to kill many, many others? So when is a certain limited violence necessary to prevent greater violence? And if there's no resistance to an aggressive form of military, that may just lead to, obviously, immense injustice as well. And so at what point must violence be used to prevent greater violence against innocent citizens, children, women, men, and what are the conditions for that? And yet what is the danger of going down even a just war argument tradition? So there's a tension in Augustine's thinking as he draws from his Roman heritage of Cicero and Seneca and the just war tradition, and his Christian tradition of Sermon on the Mount and Beatitudes. And given his historic context that Rome was no more a stable empire, but in fact it was beginning to fall apart, and violence is being enacted on the citizens, in his case Northern Africa, but as the Goths and Visigoths and others are moving, crossing the Rubicon into Rome and moving ever southward into North Africa, Augustine is living in this difficult tension. Ideally, the Sermon on the Mount and Beatitudes is how people of Christianity should live. But practically speaking, when in fact violence is dominating, when is some form of violence necessary to resist and oppose greater violence? And as a bishop and a shepherd of a large diocese and a person who is much respected for his thinking in theology and exegesis, larger ecclesial issues, as well as public life and larger political life himself, how is he to live in this tension? So very important on a war-peace issue is what happens when a person's thrownness or period of history is one in which, in fact, the context they've grown up in is no more, and you have very aggressive forces moving into your area, your territory, and quite willing to kill, rape, pillage, destroy your own people. And is pacifism the answer, or must some form of coordinated violence be used to resist this? Because if not, then you even have greater violence, and you set up a situation just as the Roman Empire had unjust peace. So what was happening again was just another form of unjust peace. So those who were once the victims become the freedom fighters, and they do the same thing as the empire itself does in a much more powerful way. So Augustine's living at this very complex period of time in which he has to somehow think through and live forth these issues. I want to finish with then also the Point Grey Rock, which is the next in Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver. Very significant, because what this story is about is, we sometimes think of War and Peace as humans, ignorant armies clashing by night, and why humans engage in war and the longing for peace. But the Point Grey Rock one takes the issue to a metaphysical level, just not a physical level of humans grappling with power or lack of it, just peace, peace without justice, order without justice. But they're going to argue great spiritual forces are at work that antedate and continue to exist in the present tense. Anyone who's been up to University of British Columbia, if you come along the oceanside route of Spanish Banks and Jericho Beach, if you continue going up around that area into what's called Arcade, it's also Wreck Beach, so if you go down there, that's one of the areas some people go and some don't, because it's now an area in the summer, which is Wreck Beach. It was a huge political clash many a decade ago. It's a nude beach. But when you go out on that area, there's the Point Grey Rock. And for First Nations people, this is a very important icon, a symbol in terms of war, peace issues. Tyee in First Nations language, particularly on the West Coast, means the big fish, the Chinook, the spring fish, they're the big ones. And one of the Tyee was the West Wind, and he was very powerful, a violent Tyee, and he would often create huge storms in the water just off what came to be UBC. Ships would be coming, and First Nations people would be wanting to sail around that point, and in his vindictiveness and brutality, he would create massive waves that would drown people, destroy them. And so as a Tyee, the Tyee are the salmon, the great fish in that sense, the big ones, he was destructive. So you have these spiritual powers, some can be very negative, very, very destructive. And so the Sagali Tyee, the Great Spirit in that sense, he often appears to First Nations as 4 men in a canoe. 4 is very important here, obviously, because it's the 4 organs of what it means to be an integrated human being. There's mind or thinking, there's imagination, or intuition, there's the senses, and then there's the will. So inevitably, when Sagali Tyee, the Great Spirit of all, when he appears in a canoe, and of course the canoe is the body, so you have these 4 organs of knowing. When they're properly integrated, they embody the best way of knowing in the body, in this case the canoe, sailing across water. Of course, water is historically one element of interpreting, is the nature of sailing across water of time and its turbulence and unpredictability, and staying afloat. How does one stay afloat in the midst of the storm? So the Sagali Tyee appears as the 4 men in the boat, integrated way of knowing, as I say, mind, imagination, senses, and the will. The boat is the body by which those organs of knowing are embodied across, and they come sailing across the surf, in which they confront this Tyee, the West Wind, who's brutal and takes advantage of First Nations people, and he's violent. And so these are the spiritual world, which in this case is, they're not dealing in this particular legend of Vancouver with First Nations people per se. And the clash between the Sagali Tyee, the great one, the great chief, the chief of all chiefs, as he confronts a lesser Tyee, finally in that battle between them, agon again, war and peace at the highest level, he transforms the West Wind Tyee in its lust for power into a rock. And that rock is Point Grey Rock, that's just off the shoreline. And so And in doing so, he turned that rocks, the four in the canoe, into something positive. So now the belief is that the waters, when they're pure, when people will sail around that rock now assists people when they want to. If they get close to that rock, there'll be a gentle push from that rock, and the waves that will come from that, they won't have to paddle as hard, and it will move them around that part of the point, or take them back around the waterway into Jericho Beach, Spanish Banks, and then finally up into the Narrows or Stanley Park. And so that rock, in the clash or the war between the Sagalitai, the great chief, and the West Wind, the brutal one, the violent one, he was transformed into this rock, which is a symbol for the Capilano or the Squamish, of what happens to those who just are about power and dominance and not wisdom, or not about justice. They get transformed into something. Interesting enough, in many Coast Salish stories, those who are only think power in themselves are narcissistic. They're turned into something rock. There's nothing to them anymore. They lose their life. They become frozen in that sense, versus people who are alive, they're turned into trees, and so they continue. There's life, there's budding, there's blossoming, there's fruit, and so depending on choices will determine what you become when you leave this world you cross. So this particular story, the Point Rock one, is very, very much about, again, conflict. It's about clashing. It's about higher spiritual levels, of which, and of course you get the same story in the broader Christian tradition of Satanas, which you get Milton's Paradise Lost, you get the Genesis story. In that sense, you've got forces at work that very much impact humans also, but the rock, the Point Grey rock, was transformed by Sagalitale into this into this rock, which now serves good. And so the conflict, which could be, and at one point was destructive to many people, now has been transformed into that which assists people as they're paddling, they're canoeing around that water. And the waters, as they touch that rock, there's a gentle wind that creates waves and moves them to their destination with less and less effort. And so when we think again of these issues of Islam, Constantinian fall, the issue of conflict that you find that Augustine would have had to face, is grappling with Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, just war. The same in the Point Grey story. It is about clash. It's about tensions. Obviously, in the Point Grey story, it ends positively. Not all stories end positively. So it's a comedic ending, as it were, in the Point Grey story. Augustine watched many tragic stories, but as he grappled with the just war, Beatitudes, trying to think through. And of course, in the Point Rock story, violence did have to be used to tame the lesser Tai, the West Wind, the brutal one that was not one of wisdom and justice. And then that rock constantly is a message. It's like an icon. It's a metaphor to those who only think of power and violence and a narcissistic understanding of my will be done, and not thinking of the implications of that for other people.